studio was supposed to be empty by now. It wasn't. John Lennon sat on a folding chair in the corner of the control room, staring at a microphone stand through the glass. The red recording light was off. Had been for hours. Outside, rain blurred the windows of the building, turning the streetlights into soft orange smears. It was late. Too late for this conversation. But Paul McCartney wasn't leaving. He stood near the mixing board, arms crossed, jaw set. His face looked older than it had a year ago. Maybe two. The kind of aging that doesn't come from time, but from something heavier. Something unresolved. George and Ringo had left an hour earlier. They knew what was coming. Everyone did. The tension in that room wasn't new. It had been building for months, maybe longer. But tonight, it had weight. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. John hadn't said much all day. He'd shown up on time, played what needed to be played, and then sat down in that chair, quiet, distant, like he was already somewhere else. Paul had tried to ignore it, tried to keep working, tried to pretend that if they just kept moving forward, kept recording, kept being what they'd always been, the cracks wouldn't spread. But the cracks were spreading. "You're not even here," Paul said finally. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room was small enough that every word landed. John didn't look up. "I'm here," he said. "No," Paul said, "you're not." The rain outside grew louder. Or maybe the silence inside just made it seem that way. John leaned back in the chair, eyes still on the glass. His hands rested on his knees. Calm. Too calm. "I'm done, Paul." Paul's face tightened. Not with anger. Not yet. With something closer to disbelief. Done with what? This. John gestured vaguely toward the studio. The microphone. The board. The room itself. Paul exhaled through his nose. Slow. Controlled. "We've got an album to finish, I know. We've got tour dates, I know. We've got people depending on, I know." Paul's hands curled into fists at his sides. Not in threat. Just in frustration. The kind that comes from holding something too tightly for too long. "Then what are you saying?" John finally looked at him. "I'm saying I can't do this anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thick, unavoidable. Paul stared at him. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked like he wanted to argue, to fight, to pull John back from wherever he was going. But he didn't. Because somewhere deep down, Paul had known this was coming. They all had. The thing about being in a band, really being in one, the kind where you grow up together, where you build something bigger than any of you could have built alone, is that you stop being just yourself. You become part of something. A sound. A movement. A machine. And machines don't stop easily. John Lennon had been part of that machine for years. He'd written songs that millions of people sang. He'd played stages so big the crowd looked like an ocean. He'd smiled for cameras, signed autographs, answered the same questions over and over until the words stopped meaning anything. And for a long time, it had been enough. But somewhere along the way, it stopped. He couldn't point to the exact moment. There wasn't a single event. No dramatic breaking point. Just a slow, quiet realization that the person he was becoming wasn't the person he wanted to be. The music had started to feel like a job. The creativity had started to feel like obligation. The joy had started to feel like performance. And John didn't know how to perform joy anymore. Paul didn't understand that. Paul was different. Paul thrived in structure, in deadlines, in the push and pull of collaboration. He could write a song in the morning, record it in the afternoon, and still have energy left to plan the next one. For Paul, the music was the point. For John, The music had become the problem. Not because it was bad, not because it didn't matter, but because it had started to matter too much to everyone else. The pressure wasn't just external, it was internal. The weight of expectation, the need to be brilliant every time, to top what came before, to give people something they didn't even know they wanted. It was exhausting, and John was tired. Paul stepped forward. His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "We can take a break. We can slow down. We don't have to." "It's not about slowing down," John said. "Then what is it about?" John looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just something sad, something final. "I don't know who I am anymore," John said, "and I can't figure it out while I'm still doing this." Paul's jaw clenched. He looked away, toward the glass, toward the microphone, toward the space where they'd recorded so many songs. "So you're just going to walk away," Paul said. "I'm not walking away. Then what are you doing?" "I'm choosing something else." The distinction mattered, at least to John. Walking away meant abandoning, meant failure, meant giving up. Choosing something else meant there was still a future, just a different one. Paul didn't see it that way. "You're breaking us apart," Paul said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Not much, just enough. John felt it. "Maybe we were already broken," John said. Paul turned sharply. His eyes were wet, but his expression was hard. "Don't put this on me, I'm not. You are. You're acting like this is something we did to you, like we held you down, like we kept you from." "Paul." John's voice was soft, steady. Paul stopped. John stood slowly. He crossed the room. Not quickly, not aggressively, just deliberately. He stopped a few feet from Paul, close enough to be heard, far enough to give space. "I love you," John said. Paul blinked. His breath hitched. "I love George. I love Ringo. I love what we built. I love what we did. But I can't love it more than I love myself." Paul's face broke. Just for a second. Just enough to show the weight he'd been carrying. "What about the people who need this?" Paul asked. "What about the kids who listen to us and feel like they're not alone? What about the ones who... I can't save them if I can't save myself?" The sentence was simple. It was also devastating. Because it wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive. It was just true. And Paul knew it. He looked down. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him. "What am I supposed to tell them?" Paul asked quietly. John didn't answer right away. "Tell them the truth," John said. "Which is what?" John thought about it, about the right words. The honest ones. "Tell them I needed to remember what it felt like to be a person before I was a name." Paul closed his eyes. A tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it quickly. "I hate this," Paul whispered. "I know. I hate that you're right." John smiled faintly. It wasn't happy. It was just understanding. "I'll hate it too," John said. "Probably tomorrow. Definitely next week." Paul let out a choked laugh. Half sob, half release. They stood there in the quiet. Two people who had built a world together, who had harmonized in a way that made strangers cry, who had argued and fought and laughed and created until they couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And now it was ending. Not because of hate, not because of betrayal, but because sometimes love means letting go. Paul finally looked up. His eyes were red but clear. "You're really doing this?" "Yeah." "You're really leaving?" "Yeah." Paul nodded slowly. He wiped his face with the heel of his hand. "Then I hope you find it," Paul said. "Find what?" Whatever it is you're looking for. John didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Paul turned and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. He didn't turn around. "When you're ready to come back," Paul said, "we'll be here." John's throat tightened. "I don't think I'm coming back," John said. Paul's shoulders tensed. He nodded once. Then he opened the door and walked out. The sound of the rain grew louder for a moment. Then the door closed, and John was alone. He stood there in the empty studio. The red light was still off. The microphone still stood behind the glass. He could feel the weight of it, the decision, the finality, but he also felt something else. Relief. Not happiness. Not yet, but relief. Like he'd been holding his breath underwater and finally broke the surface. The news spread quickly. Within days, the headlines were everywhere. Newspapers, radio, television. People argued about it in cafes and living rooms and street corners. Some called him selfish. Some called him brave. Some called him a fool. Most just didn't understand. How could someone walk away from that much success, that much influence, that much love? But they weren't asking the right question. The question wasn't why he left. It was why he stayed so long. John spent the next few months in silence. Not public silence, actual silence. He stopped performing. Stopped recording. Stopped being the version of himself people expected. He read. He painted. He thought. He learned what it felt like to wake up without a schedule, to sit with boredom, to miss the music without needing to fix it immediately. And slowly, quietly, he started to remember who he was before all of it. Not John Lennon the musician. Not John Lennon the icon. Just John. It wasn't easy. There were days he regretted it. Days he wanted to call Paul and say he'd made a mistake. Days he wondered if he'd thrown away the only thing that ever mattered. But those days passed, and what remained was something quieter, something truer. He realized that the music had never been the problem. The problem was that he'd let it become his identity instead of his expression. And once he understood that, he could start again. Not for the crowds, not for the legacy, but for himself. Years later, someone asked him if he regretted leaving. John thought about it for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I regret that I waited so long." They asked if he'd ever go back. He smiled. "I never really left," he said. "I just stopped pretending I was still there." The interviewer didn't understand, but John did. And that was enough.